Well, I found out this week we've made somebody else mad at us. It seems some preacher in town saw our Facebook posts about our Sunday night guided meditation group, and he has denounced it as a tool of the devil and censured us as liberal Christians who give Jesus a bad name. I love it. Now, this preacher isn't alone in his assessment. Others, too, have declared us just 2 steps away from perdition. I once got a nasty voicemail on my office phone from a lady in town who was highly offended by a program we had a few years ago where we had real live Muslims as presenters. Not too long ago, there was a guy leaving nasty comments on our Facebook page disparaging our rainbow benches out front, as well as the heinous sin of having a men's Bible study at a bar where we drink beer. I once read a hate-filled letter to the editor in the Daily Herald, and so I responded with a letter of my own, and I thought I was pointed in my disagreement, but civil. And a few days later, I got a note delivered here to the church from the man who'd written the original letter, raking me over the coals for the effronteries of my letter. And then he said he forgave me. Sweet of him, right? I got to be honest with you. There's a part of me that is just tickled to death when we honk somebody off like that. Personally, I don't think the church is doing its job if we aren't getting under somebody's skin. I mean, Jesus didn't wind up on a cross because he was the favorite speaker at the Rotary Club. He wound up on a cross because loyalty to God alone is countercultural. So I'm not afraid of making people mad as long as we're making them mad because we're trying our best to be disciples of Jesus. Nothing more, nothing less, and nothing else. Of course, I can't help but feel a little sorry for folks who somehow think the gospel of Jesus gives them carte blanche to condemn those with whom they disagree. Heard about a lady named Mildred who was the self-appointed monitor of her church's morals. She was constantly berating her fellow Christians for not measuring up to the high standards God had set for us all. And one day she happened to be driving down the street and past the town's only bar, and she saw George's old pickup truck parked out front. So at church the following Sunday, she cornered George and a group of people at church and made sure that they heard her as she scolded loudly, "George, I saw your pickup truck parked outside the bar the other day, and that's just disgraceful. What a terrible witness you are to this town." George said nothing. But later that evening, he drove over to Mildred's house, pulled into her driveway, parked his truck, got out, and walked home. Left it there all night long for all the neighbors to see. I really like George. He knew there are limits to our perception and that judging others in the long run can backfire on you. So I could really feel smug about my enlightened perspectives if I hadn't decided to preach today on this text from Matthew 21. It's a story about a landowner who plants a vineyard and leases it to tenant farmers to cultivate it, harvest the grapes, make the wine, and share the profits. But when he sends his slaves to collect his share of the produce, the tenants beat up 2 of them and kill the other one. A second group of slaves gets treated the same way. Finally, the landowner sends his son, and he too is murdered. And when the chief priests and the elders and the Pharisees and the other religious leaders heard that story, they got mad and started plotting how to kill Jesus. Now, the usual interpretation of this parable claims that the chief priests and the others got mad because Jesus was equating them with the wicked tenants. But I don't think so. You see, in the world of Jesus' day, it had become commonplace for wealthy people like the chief priests and elders to buy land out from under peasant farmers, some of whom were farming land that had been in their families for generations. And so now their only option was to keep farming the land, retaining only a pittance of the produce for themselves, while enriching the landowners by their labor. Those tenant farmers often despaired of ever being able to raise their families out of a subsistence income, and they used whatever means was at their disposal to repossess the land. Desperate people often turn to desperate measures. So the chief priests and the elders, wealthy landowners, all of them, would not have identified with the tenants in the story. They would have identified with the owner of the vineyard. And when Jesus asked them, well, now what is the vineyard owner going to do? Well, they show their true colors. They say, well, he'll put those wretches to a miserable death and lease the vineyard out to other tenants who will give him his produce at the harvest time. But did you notice that in the parable, the landowner never does that? In fact, the landowner in the parable shows remarkable mercy for his tenants. If the chief priest had been telling the story, the tenants would have gotten their comeuppance after the first infraction. But in Jesus' story, the landowner gives them chance after chance after chance, even to the point of the seemingly reckless decision to send his own son. He exacts no retribution from the tenants. And Jesus says, okay, you chief priests and big shots, you may seek revenge, and for that your goose is cooked. But I'm here to tell you that's not the way God works. The stone that the builders rejected has become the cornerstone. And that's why the chief priests and the elders got mad. Jesus' parable forced them to look at themselves, and they didn't like what they saw. Jesus' parable became a mirror reflecting the depth of their own complicity with an unjust society, exposing their loyalty to money and power while still professing their loyalty to God. In the mirror of this parable, they saw just how skewed their perception of God had become. They had created God in their own image. They were like the old woman in a church in Florence, Italy, on her knees, praying fervently in front of an exquisite painting of the Virgin Mary. A man on vacation happened to wander into the church, and he noticed the look of devotion on the woman's face as she whispered reverent words and gazed up at the painting. And as he was heading out the door, he chanced upon a priest, and he said, you know, that old woman is certainly devout. And the priest said, oh, don't be too impressed. You see, many years ago, she modeled for the artist who painted that picture. So what she's really worshiping is herself. The chief priests and elders were worshiping themselves, just like that old woman. The parable laid bare the true object of their devotion. No wonder they wanted to bump Jesus off. Nobody enjoys having their masks ripped away. So I can't be too harsh on those people who are quick to condemn and slow to be merciful. When the mirror of the gospel is held up to my eyes, I can see a man who does much the same thing, but hides it behind a veneer of intellect and snarky humor. The person in the mirror is too often the person I loathe on the other side of it. Like the chief priest, I want those people to get what's coming to them without realizing I have blind spots about myself. A rabbit and a rattlesnake were talking, and they realized that they had never seen their reflection, so neither one knew what they looked like. So they decided to describe for the other one what each one looked like. So the rattlesnake said to the rabbit, you have a soft cottony tail, long floppy ears, pink twinkling eyes, and a twitchy little nose. And the rabbit said, "Hooray, I'm just who I thought I was. I'm a bunny rabbit." But then he realized he was afraid to tell the rattlesnake what he looked like. But he'd made a promise. So he said, "You're very slick and shiny, and you have beady little eyes set too close together, but you have diamonds sprinkled all over you." And the rattlesnake wailed, "Oh no. Here I've spent my whole life thinking I was a rattlesnake, but now I find out I'm a TV evangelist." Now, you can use that joke to insult whoever you want to. Do you dare to look in the mirror of the gospel? You might not like what you see. You might find out something about yourself that you didn't count on. You know, I really appreciate the way somebody has paraphrased the familiar serenity prayer. God, help me to accept the people I cannot change, the courage to change the one I can, and the wisdom to know that it's me. But you know, if you look in that gospel mirror closely, I think you'll see something else. You'll see something the chief priest completely missed. I think you'll see behind you a God with more love, more forgiveness, more grace than you could ever imagine. The chief priests didn't see that God in the mirror. They only saw the God that was as self-centered as they were. But if they had just looked deeper into the mirror, they would have seen a God standing behind them who is just like the landowner. A God who gives us second chances over and over and over and over. A God who will not give up on us even when we have given up on Him and even when we've given up on ourselves. It's all there in the mirror if you have the courage to look. Some of you may remember the story about Dr. Bill Blevins, big bearded professor of religion at Carson Newman College in Tennessee. He was a presenter at a conference I attended, and during the week he told us the story of why he grew his beard. It had nothing to do with fashion or wanting to look professorial. No, he said it came about because of a crisis in his life. He said he'd been a Christian for a long time, been a preacher for a long time, been a religion professor for a long time, but one day he decided he'd had enough. He was tired of church, tired of the Bible, tired of preaching, tired of teaching religion, and most of all, he was tired of God. It just all seemed so pointless to him. Oh, not that he didn't attempt to get everything right again. He prayed, but God didn't seem interested in answering his prayers. So after a while, he just said to himself, "Know what? Forget it. I'm throwing in the towel on this faith stuff." Now, for a religion professor to renounce one's faith is doubly problematic. In most venues, it's not only a spiritual issue, but a professional one as well. I mean, most religious institutions, particularly Baptist universities like Carson Newman, aren't real keen on an atheist teaching theology. And Blevins had a family to support and a mortgage to pay. So he quietly went down to the local state college and enrolled in a degree program in psychology with the idea that he would gradually move from one field into another. Instead of a religion professor, he would become a psychology professor. He didn't say anything about it, of course, and anytime someone asked, "Why are you studying over at that other school?" he'd lie and say, "Oh, it's continuing education." But Bill Blevins had no intention of using psychology in his religion professorship. Once the degree was finished and a new job opened up, he would be gone. Finished with faith, finished with the church, finished with God. And things were rocking along pretty well. He was making progress toward that new degree, moving toward that goal of a career change as well as a life change. But one day, He was scurrying across campus with 25,000 other students, his mind occupied with papers he had to write and tests he needed to take and books he needed to read and assignments he had to finish. And he rounded the corner of a building and he met Jesus. I can't explain that, and neither could he. But he met Jesus. Now, you need to understand, Bill Blevins is not some wild-eyed fanatic given to visions and mystical experiences. He's a serious, level-headed, reasonable scholar. But he said in that moment, Jesus was somehow more real to him than the throngs of students swarming around the campus. And Jesus said, Bill, I know you don't love me anymore, but I want you to know I still love you. And Bill Blevins said to us at that conference, that day, I began to grow this beard so that every time I look into the mirror, I am reminded of the day when I encountered the grace of a God who wouldn't give up on me, even when I had given up on him. When you look in the mirror, what do you see? If that mirror is the gospel of Christ, whether you like what you see or not, if you look closely, you'll see behind you a God who won't give up on you, even when you give up on him. Praise God.